So you might remember from chapter 3, we talked about categorizing matter. Um, uh, we had the pure substances, elements, and compounds. We looked in more detail at elements last time with chapter 4. Today we'll look in more detail at compounds. Mixtures will be much later in the semester. Okay, so pure substances, we can take that idea of pure substances, break it down into elements and compounds. And again, we talked a little bit about elements last time, but there's a few things I want to emphasize here related to elements. Elements can happen in two ways. So we're looking a lot in this chapter at how things are connected together, how atoms are connected together. So one way elements can happen are atomic elements. So the idea there is the element is just existing as an atom of that element without anything else around. Noble gases would be a good example of that. We can also have molecular elements. So if you remember back to chapter 1, molecules are things which exist as a combination of atoms. So O2 would be an example of a molecular element. It's a molecule because there's two or more atoms together. It's an element because all of the atoms have the same symbol. So anything where you have more than one present, so we would know that by the subscript. So subscript of 2 there would make it a molecule. But because they're both oxygen, it's also an element. Whereas for this one, for neon, it is an atomic element. You only have individual atoms. It does not exist as a group of atoms. But in each case, those are elements because there's only one type of thing present. Only neon in this example and oxygen in this example. For compounds, we can also have compounds exist in two ways. There's actually more than two ways for elements. For now, we'll just think of those two ways. We'll talk about some other ways a bit later in the semester. For compounds, again, two ways. We can also have molecules. We can have groups of atoms existing as kind of one unit, but within those groups of atoms, not each of them is the same thing. So here we have H2O. We have our lights kind of flickered there. So we'll just hopefully it will work out. So for H2O, we have 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen. We have different types of elements, but they exist as unit. Each time we have water, we have 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen. Okay, so that is a molecular compound. We also have what are called ionic compounds. In an ionic compound, you also have a formula. And so the thing there at the bottom that's covered up a little bit is the NaCl as the formula for this compound. And the difference with an ionic compound is that it is not one unit. It's not that you have an Na and a Cl together. In an ionic compound, you have an ongoing structure. Okay, so we're showing that here. So that's the difference between ionic and molecular compounds. So a little bit more here about ionic compounds. Ionic compounds form between oppositely charged ions. And from chapter 4, we might have a sense of what kind of charges we would have there. For the positive charge, we will probably have a metal. And for the negative charge, we will probably have a nonmetal. So you have positive charges and negative charges together. The opposite charges attract each other. And when they do so, we end up forming these compounds. For the ionic compounds, the charge of one and the other must balance out. Here we're looking at sodium chloride. Sodium has a +1 charge. Chloride has a -1 charge. So +1 -1 adds up to 0. So they balance. In some cases, the charges will not be the same. You could have a +2 and a -1. In that case, what would happen, I don't know what that is. I'm going to just close it. If that happens, then you need more of the one with the lower charge. And the way the math works out here, the charge of one often will determine the subscript of the other. So if you have a +2 charge and a -1 charge, you need 2 -1s to balance the +2, and 1 +2 to balance the 2 -1s. Okay, so we'll see some examples of doing that. Okay, so these are ionic compounds. A lot of what we'll be looking at will be ionic compounds today, and in lab we'll talk a little bit more about molecular compounds.